Thank you, Vita, for this introduction. And I'm very glad to be with you all. I see already many friends joining, not only from Denmark, but from Scandinavia. And great to be with Peter and Ghassan this afternoon. Actually, Bethlehem Venner is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. Congratulations!
Thank you.
I mean, this is a great achievement if you think of it, and I'm glad that thanks to so many of you who are active all the time, this work continue on. I would have loved to be with you in person, but because of the pandemic, we need to do it this way. So I cannot give you hugs. So and maybe at the pandemic, hugs are not something even good. So the theme I thought I will focus on is Pax Americana, Palestine and the Middle East in the Trump era. And I'm sure there will be some overlap maybe with Ghassan, but I look forward for the discussion afterwards. And the question may be, why look back? I mean, isn't Trump era over? And so should we focus on Biden? I mean, I have published few things about Biden and what change might Biden bring or not. But the Trump era, unfortunately, is not over for many reasons. One, because over 70 million people voted for him, and they are not going to disappear overnight. But also some of the things that he did, like moving the embassy to Jerusalem, etc., will not be undo in the coming years. What I'm interested in is basically quickly to look at how the Bible and theology has been weaponized in the Trump era by his base, but then to see that actually it's more than that. The American support to Israel is not only something that is based on the Bible. It's much more complicated. And so I will look at that in the second half a bit more in depth. If we look at the Trump era and his so-called deal of the century, or what I call here the Pax Romana, it has three legs, three elements. And all three elements, if you look even at the title, you can see how the Bible is being used or misused. The first thing that he did was moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. While for Trump himself, this was based on the facts on the ground, meaning that the Israeli Knesset, etc., are in Jerusalem. For his base, but even for his vice president, Pence, who is a Catholic Christian Zionist, the Bible played a very important role. And there, actually, if you, for example, if you listen to the speech that Pence gave at the Israeli Knesset, he talks about King David having made Jerusalem as the capital of Israel 3,000 years ago. And this is why it should be there. So it's very much, if you look at the language of Pence, but also of the other Christian Zionists, you can see how David has been evoked over and over again. So you see the Bible played role in that one. But even the second leg of his peace plan, if we can call it even peace plan, was his idea or his son-in-law's idea, prosperity for peace. And choosing the word prosperity, I think it's not by chance. Remember that all of these Christian Zionists actually, and the so-called Christian right in the States, they believe in the so-called prosperity gospel. This is what they have actually been exporting in many of the poor countries. In fact, they exploit the poor people in Latin America and certain countries in Africa and Asia by promising them prosperity if they follow their gospel, as to say. And so even in the choice of the word prosperity, you can actually hear that ideology of the Christian right active. And the third leg, and we will hear more from Hassan about it, was the Abraham Accord. I mean, using Abraham actually as a cover for these deals that were done with the United Arab Emirates, with Morocco, etc. And if you listen again to Pence's speech at the Knesset, he talked about the importance of Abraham as the father of Isaac and Ishmael. For him, Ishmael is represented by the Arab states, Isaac is represented by Israel, and so it is so to say happy end. In the Bible, there is no happy end for Ishmael Isaac, because Ishmael is still the one who is second-class citizen. He is the son of the slave, so to say. But now Trump comes and he actually brings together what God was not able to bring together, Isaac and Ishmael. So that these are the three legs for the Pax Americana. And as I said, in all three, we see how the Trump administration employed biblical language in its Middle Eastern policy to please its evangelical base. Yet, while Christian Zionism ideology has been an important factor powering Trump's policies towards Israel, it is overly simplistic to believe that it is the primary element. What is, I think, more important is how biblical images are interwoven with a dominant American, what I call meta-narrative, that constitutes the foundation for the Pax Americana of the Middle East. And here I would like to refer to three major elements in this meta-narrative. One is the role of Israel. And by the way, many of these are not going to change under Biden. So the first one is the role of Israel. Israel, in quotation mark, has a special place in American discourse. There is an invisible bond that binds America and Israel together. When the US looks into the mirror, it does not see itself, but Israel. And when it looks at Israel, it sees itself. This is something very important. Why? Because both nations are settler colonial nations who occupied the lands of native people and pushed them into small reservations. This is actually very obvious, again, in Vice President Pence's speech at the Israeli Knesset. I quote, Pence is saying, during his historic visit to Jerusalem, President Trump declared that the bond between us, in his word, is woven together in the hearts of our people, and the people of the United States have always held a special affection and admiration for the people of the book. In the story of the Jews, we have always seen the story of America. It is the story of an exodus, a journey from persecution to freedom, a story that shows the power of faith and the promise of hope. My country's first settlers also saw themselves as pilgrims sent by providence to build a new promised land. The songs and stories of the people of Israel were their anthems, and they faithfully taught them to their children and do to this day. So this settler colonialism is embedded in the notion of the chosen people, a notion that has played a prominent role in Jewish Israeli thought, as well as in American culture over the past 5 decades. The notion of a chosen people is often translated in American culture as American and Israeli exceptionalism and religious nationalism. So the Christian Zionists, they view America as the new Israel, or less directly, as a divinely elect nation of the contemporary world, chosen to save the world via its politics, economics, and culture, as well as its own moral goodness, if only to stay true to its true self. These narratives interweave elements of the biblical narrative with those of American history and myth, resulting in a synchronized nationalistic narrative of American chosenness that equates faithfulness to America with faithfulness to Jesus Christ, thus making American national identity a gospel imperative. So the bond between Israel and the US is close to being metaphysical. In an almost apocalyptic view, the world is imagined as the battleground between the forces of evil against those of good. The US and Israel are clearly seen on the right side of history. In the apocalyptic discourse, this battle will take place at the end of time, but here it is already happening now. And the US and Israel are fighting not only their own battle, but that of God. Again, I quote Pence, and I'm here to convey a simple message from the heart of the American people. America stands with Israel. We stand with Israel because your cause is our cause, your values are our values, and your fight is our fight. We stand with Israel because we believe in right over wrong, in good over evil, in liberty over tyranny. We stand with Israel because that's what Americans have always done, and so has it been since my country's earliest days. So Pence was speaking here about something more than a political or military alliance. This is a metaphysical alliance almost, an alliance of right against evil. So that's the first point. The second point that we need to keep in mind is the militarization. It may not be pure chance that the name chosen by Trump for his Middle East plan, you know what it is, the deal of the century, right? The deal of the century was originally the name of a 1983 American comedy featuring several American arms dealers trying to sell weapons to South American dictators. So arms deals were an important aspect of Trump's deal of the century. If we look at our region, in 2019, 3 countries in the Middle East spent over $100 billion on defense. Imagine, 100 billion with B. 62 billion by Saudi Arabia, third only after the US and China, 20 billion by Israel, 12 billion by Iran. With the latest $23 billion arms deal that the United Arab Emirates did with Trump one day before he left office, comes second in terms of military spending. The region is the recipient of over half of all weapons delivered to developing countries and over 1/4 of all arms shipments worldwide. 5 of the top 10 most militarized countries globally are found in the Middle East. Israel is the most militarized country in the region. So we have to understand that the main beneficiary of this spending is the US, and its military industry is the #1 exporters of arms to the region. So if we look today at the region, from Libya to Yemen, from Syria to Iraq, from Lebanon to Gaza, it looks very much like a shipwreck. And we have to understand that while in the first place, maybe the Christian right lobby plays an important role in this militarization, it's the military industrial lobby that plays a very important role in binding the US and Israel together. And last but not least, and here I will end, populism versus human rights. And this might change actually under Biden. This is the only thing that might change. An important feature of the Trump plan was its disregard for international law and the right to self-determination. This was obvious from Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel capital and recognition of the annexation of West Sahara by Morocco. The Trump plan must be seen in a context of growing populism and right-wing ideologies in the US, Europe, Israel, and across the globe. All the accomplishments and lessons learned following Second World War that were enshrined in the Human Rights Charter, in the Geneva Convention, international law, are being questioned by these populist leaders. President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have to be seen in this context. For them, might constitutes right. What is frightening is how God is portrayed as enabler of populism. In many speeches, both Trump and Netanyahu were celebrated as God's messenger here on earth to fulfill his will. Again, this was expressed most clearly in the prayer of one of the pastors at the opening of the American embassy in Jerusalem. I quote, "We want to thank you, Lord, especially today for the courageous leadership of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his determination to do whatever it takes to protect his people at all costs. We want to thank you for the tremendous leadership of our great president, Donald Trump. Without President Trump's determination, resolve, courage, we would not have be here today. And I believe further, I speak for every one of us when we say, we thank you every day that you have given us a president who boldly stands on the right side of history, but more importantly, stands on the right side of you, O God." So in short, it's not Jesus that is sitting to the right hand of God, but it's Trump and Netanyahu have assumed divine qualities.
Okay.
They stand on the right side of history and of God. This ideology is highly dangerous, especially as it is propagated by several powerful lobbies in the US. So it is this unholy alliance of religion, culture, military, and economy and the media that promotes and creates this Pax Americana. The real danger of this ideology is that it gives biblical and moral cover to the Israelization of Jerusalem and the exclusion of the Palestinian population by the Israeli government. It advocates for an exclusive Jerusalem, only for Jews. And so this Pax Americana, or Pax Romana, as in the Bible, stand in clear opposition to Pax Christi. We believe that in Jesus, God became human, thus making all human lives sacred. Thus, human rights may not be violated in the name of divine rights or the Bible used to take precedence over international law. The peace that Jesus came to proclaim is a peace based on justice and on the preferential option for the marginalized. To weaponize scripture and its biblical figures like David and Abraham for political ends, armed deals, and exploitation is nothing other than an unholy misuse of God's holy name. The scriptures are text of liberation and not text of occupation, annexation, and militarization. It is true that the Trump era has come to an end, yet his evangelical base and Zionist supporters are still spreading fake news and biblical myths to achieve their political goals. I will stop here and look forward to listening to my colleagues.